Our ontology actually determines the universe that we perceive out of all of the possible universes that can exist or do exist. Therefore, ontology is very powerful. If you change your ontology, you change your consciousness. And if you change your consciousness, you actually change the universe in which you live. Not in the sense of altering reality, but in the sense of selecting out from the many possible universes that could be the actual universe in which you exist. Ontology is an extremely powerful tool for changing our experience. Well, you might say, this sounds like science fiction. How does it actually work? The relationship between ontology and consciousness is based on the decoherence of the universal quantum wave function. The universal quantum wave function represents all possibilities of all universes that could exist. And in some way, they actually do exist. But which one do we really experience? That depends on how we decohere the universal quantum wave function. This is the process of converting indefinite probabilities of what could be to definite possibilities of what will be. And then, out of those, selecting the one possibility that we will actualize into reality, into our experience. There's a nice example of this called Schrödinger's cat. It's a classical example used in quantum physics. We have a device where there's a cat kept in a box along with a pellet of cyanide. There's a detector that monitors a subatomic decay. If the atom decays, then the detector is triggered, the cyanide capsule is opened, and the cat dies. If not, then nothing happens, and we open the box to find the cat alive. So when we look at the box, we cannot say whether or not the cat is alive or dead, because we cannot say, until we measure it, whether or not a particular atom has decayed during a specific span of time. Therefore, in some sense, both possibilities exist simultaneously. The cat is both alive and dead, until we open the box and measure what actually happened. This is the paradox of quantum reality. It sounds like it can't be true, but it really is. It uses non-Aristotelian logic. In other words, it is both true and false at the same time. This is ontology. This is ontological thinking. This is how we can take advantage of the properties of ontology to change our consciousness and our reality. The earliest known example of ontological writing and thought is in the Vedic tradition, and specifically the part of the Vedic tradition known as Vedanta. Vedanta is ancient wisdom. It's more than 5,000 years old. And it comes from the Vedic culture of India, which is based on the Vedas. Vedanta means the final conclusion of the Vedic literature. After all is said and done, what does it all mean? What is life really about? And what is the purpose of our existence? Vedanta thought is based on a very complete ontology of consciousness, the first known such ontology in the world. Surprisingly enough, this ontology of consciousness uses non-Aristotelian language and logic, something that the Western civilization and science did not discover until about a century ago. The most important thing about Vedanta is that it provides scientific and conceptual tools for changing our ontology, which is not an easy thing to do. It's more than just changing our beliefs, more than just changing the way we use language and so forth. It's an actual change in consciousness. So Bhakti Yoga is given as a method for changing consciousness, and we will introduce these methods in other courses available through eMystics. So Vedanta is the world's first ontology of consciousness. What does Vedanta tell us about consciousness? First and most important, there is no such thing as a consciousness. You cannot take consciousness, isolate it, put it in a bottle. Consciousness is what's known as an abstract ontological class. In other words, you can't find an example of consciousness separate from everything else. It cannot be isolated, and this concept is known as non-elementalism. Just because we can name something doesn't mean that it's a separate thing that can be isolated and treated like an element. Consciousness is always associated with a subject and an object. My consciousness, and consciousness of something or other. So we also find consciousness is always associated with a living entity. It's always somebody's consciousness. My consciousness, your consciousness, his consciousness, their consciousness. There's no such thing as consciousness separate from a living being. Therefore, consciousness in the final issue is a quality of a person and is always found in association with a person, senses, form, and all the things that go along with that, like mind, intuition, initiative, creativity, memory, feelings, and so on. Now, I know we've been talking on a high theoretical platform, so I would like to give a simple analogy to explain ontology and how important it is that we adjust our ontology to match the actual nature of reality. So here's our analogy. Let's say you're walking along and you see a person sitting in a car. They happen to be parked next to a construction site. And while you're watching one of these huge cranes hoist a concrete block up to the top floor of this building, suddenly the cable breaks and this huge concrete block begins to fall towards the person sitting in the car. It's got 40 stories or 80 stories to fall, so you know you have a few seconds, but it's still very little time to convince this person to get away or they're going to be crushed. Now, how is this situation going to play out? First of all, you yourself have to have or develop a situational awareness. What is going on here? And then you have to have a cognition of the action that you need to take to save that person in the car. You're going to have to warn them. What is the situation? Then convince them to act. They have to open the door, get out, and walk away from their car because, boom, the concrete block is going to hit in just a few seconds. This is the analogy. Now, what do the different parts of this analogy mean? In our analogy, the person is the living entity, the spirit soul, as it is often called, the person within the body. And the car represents the body, or the material bodily ontology, the material conception of life that we all are conditioned to have in this world. The concrete block, of course, represents death. And, of course, death is coming to everyone in this world. That's the nature of the material world. The 40 to 80 stories that the block has to fall represents the 40 to 80 years that we might have in this world to adjust our ontology and get our heads together. When we say we have to warn the person in the car to get out and convince them to take action, this is like teaching. This is like our work. We are teaching people about ontology, trying to convince them that this is important enough that they have to do something about it to really benefit themselves. And getting out of the car and walking away, this is like making an ontological adjustment of the kind that's recommended in the Vedanta literature that changes one's universe so that one does not have to go through this experience of death. Now let's talk a little bit about this ontological adjustment that we are advising everyone to make. First of all, this is not a theoretical process. This is not an academic process of learning. It is an experiential process, and it has to be experienced, not just talked about or not just thought about. What does that mean? Well, it's not a verbal process, it's a cognitive process. The light has to go on in your head. You yourself have to understand it. Nobody can do it for you. And there's certain work that you have to do in order to reach this point. That work will actually change your consciousness. The fundamental quality of your consciousness is going to change. That's what this work is actually about. Why is it so important? Because the benefits that you get from it are incomparable. They are not to be found anywhere else. It is not a small or a cheap process. It's a big piece of work. We'll be honest about it. It could take years for you to complete it. It could take the rest of your life to complete it. And it requires very expert personal guidance from someone who has already been through the process and achieved the result. But the benefits that you get from it are nothing less than the complete cessation of all suffering. You could consider it like a chiropractic adjustment for the soul. When you go to the chiropractor, he puts your back in line and you feel so much better. Similarly, when you adjust your ontology to match the actual nature of reality, then the relief is profound, and the feelings of joy and comfort that are derived from this are also very great. As we discussed before, according to the anthropic principle, it literally changes the universe that we live in and takes us out of the universe of suffering, birth, and death and into the universe of eternity and eternal life. So Vedanta, the original ontological literature in the world, gives the process which is called Bhakti Yoga. This process is based on transcendental mantras. Transcendental refers to the quality of the ontology that these mantras invoke. There is no other known way to effectively change the ontology, change the consciousness, and change the actual world that we live in other than devotional service or bhakti yoga. And this is the subject of some of the courses that we provide through eMystics. Now let's go over some of the topics that we have presented here and the conclusions that we would like you to reach. First of all, consciousness theory is vital for science. We cannot have a truly experimental science, especially in quantum mechanics and fields like that, without a very complete ontology of consciousness. However, consciousness is currently misunderstood. The tendency in Western thought is to treat consciousness as an object when actually it's a quality of the living entity and cannot be separated from the living entity. Therefore, having a complete ontology of consciousness is the key to understanding and working with consciousness on a practical level successfully. It's also the key to improving the quality of our consciousness because we can't work with consciousness directly. We have to work with it through ontology as a tool. And the tools for changing our consciousness are found in Vedanta, which is the original source of a complete ontology of consciousness.